Welcome, all of you. We're trying a new solution here by being in another room, and clearly we already outgrown this room. We can hear the birds singing. It's autumn. We've got things on the screen. We've got two more people arriving in a moment, but I think we'll try to make a start. I mean, it gives me great pleasure to have Shamil again, telling us about. This time you will tell us about meditation. Last term you told us about Eudaimonia, but I have a suspicion that the two might be linked.
That's the idea.
And I'm sure you will be able to tell us exactly how they're linked. But I have to say, one of the things I'm really excited about is I know that you've thought long and hard about this for a very long time. And I think your background, both in philosophy, in physics, in mathematics, in deep learning, deep minds, really, I think, puts you at a very special place, because also, of course, you have your own practice of meditation. And so I can't tell you how excited I am to hear what you have to tell us. So please.
Well, thank you very much. And I also really want to thank you, Morten, for allowing me the space and the time, because there's quite a lot to say. And so Morten sort of very graciously allowed me, saying, take as much time as you need. So we're going to take this nice and slow, because it is actually kind of a big topic, especially because we've got people here who aren't familiar with the Bayesian brain hypothesis, people who aren't familiar with meditation. And so we're going to have to sort of build this up slowly, but that's always the best idea in a story, to build it up from first principles. And what I want to talk today about, the title of today's talk is The Bayesian Brain and Meditation. But really, the real title is in this subtitle, A Predictive Processing Account of Radical Changes in the Character of Phenomenal Experience. Now, that's actually code for something. It's code for experiences of awakening, of enlightenment, of liberation. And so we're going to be focusing on that high mountaintop, rather than sort of things that are often studied with meditation, like, meditation reduces stress and allows you to go about your life in a better way. That's all good, and that's a very important part of it. But we're actually going to be focusing on these radical transformations of the character of phenomenal experience. So, and I'm probably going to spend about half the time on the Bayesian brain hypothesis, and then half the time applying it specifically in meditation. But what we're going to build up in the Bayesian brain hypothesis is going to be very important to understanding how meditation works. And so I think it'll be worth it. So let's just start with this idea of, I'm out and looking at the trees, and that's my experience. But that's odd, like, how is this experience happening? And, it doesn't take long to say, well, somehow this experience is happening and something is coming in through the windows of my self, my eyes. And then the next idea is that, well, perhaps there's a sort of a impression of the tree that I'm forming in my mind. How that impression happens is a kind of a mystery which we're going to unpack, but that's the typical, I would call it naive, but perfectly natural perspective. And of course, who's observing this impression? So that's interesting, right? So my slides are kind of out of order, but that's okay. So, who's observing this impression? Now, there's one more thing, which is that we think that we are getting an impression of reality as it exists. But of course, if we've only experienced our impression, have we ever had any contact with reality as it exists? So that's very, very curious, and we're going to try to unravel this. but it was a topic that exercised philosophers. And I think we're going to jump 2,000 years and go up to Immanuel Kant, who really, I think, did a fantastic job of synthesizing this problem. And what Kant realized is that we experience our phenomenal world, the things as they appear to us. But in fact, we actually never have any experience of things in themselves, the noumenal world, Ding an sich. And what he realized is that, welcome, come. What he realized is that we have to somehow make sense of our phenomenal world. And we must bring a perceptual framework to understanding our phenomenal world. And what he argued is that we bring certain hyper-priors, like the notion that our experience is organized in space and in time and with causality. These are things that we bring to our experience. And so he talked about the fact that he thought that he had created a sort of Copernican revolution in perception, which was that objects must conform to our cognition rather than our cognitions conform to objects. And welcome, come. Please come with me in the back. Come, please. So as we see that this is a major idea from Kant. I mean, Kant, in a sense, is the Newton of philosophy. You know, he brings things together and gives us a framework which lasts a long time. So, Helmholtz, a few years later, about a century later, was very influenced by these Kantian ideas, and also starts thinking of perception as inference. And this is the key idea that we're going to have, that essentially when we perceive something, we have to infer what's going on, and we are in some sense constructing it and acting as scientists or statisticians. Now, just a quick thing, we'll come back to this later, but you know, we talked a lot about the phenomenal world here, but what about things in themselves? Das Ding an sich, you know, could there be any knowledge of this possible? You know, Kant actually thought that, of course, things exist independent of our human perception. Certainly, you know, when we move something, someone else finds it in the same place, we can make very, you know, sensible models of the world. But you know, how do we get any knowledge of this? And Kant thought that actually we can't get any real knowledge of the noumenal world. We'll come to Schopenhauer, who thinks that actually there is a back door, because Schopenhauer really brings together the ideas of Plato, Kant, and Indian philosophy in the form of the Vedanta, but we'll come on to that. So when we look out, you know, there's this very naive perspective that we have, that we're just passively experiencing the world as it's coming through the windows of our soul. But that can't be the case. That can't be the case. Perception is actually very hard. You know, okay, let's all do this. Put up your hand, arm's length, and look at your thumbnail. And your thumbnail is about all you can see accurately and in color. The rest is in black and white and a real mess. And now look around you in this room and outside. I mean, we've seen this beautiful, amazing, colorful, cartoonish definition a world. How on earth does that happen? I mean, it's really hard. Here's a little simulation of what it might be like to actually just see a snapshot of what you're seeing in color. Even this is a concession. In fact, it is, you know, it's probably much worse than this. But yeah, very difficult to make head or tail of it. Now, actually, but luckily, your brain does know what's coming through. In fact, this is the scene which our brain can easily see. Oh, look, it's a bee in a flower. But we can't understand it, but our brain can. How does the brain do that? That's the question. So how does the brain do that? Well, the brain has to solve the Bayesian perception problem. So if we have, so we've seen that we have the world, and presumably there are causes of our perception in the world. There are features of the world, and those features give us sensory data. Okay, and sensory data, it's a long vector of, for example, imagine just a long vector of pixel values, you know, and causes of my data are like that there are glasses and that there's an apple. That's what I'm seeing. And what the agent has to do is somehow determine what are the features of the world, what are the causes of my sensory data, what is the best hypothesis given my sensory data. So that's a kind of the problem. And there is a mathematically optimal solution that maximizes all the information value. If for example, and that solution is called Bayes' theorem, okay? And it's because we're going to focus quite a bit on this. I'm just going to, you know, you might remember it from school, but I'm just going to remind you of some terms in this because it's very, very important for what's to follow. So what the agent wants to do, as we said, is figure out the probability density function of the features of the world, of your hypothesis of what's going on. What is the best hypothesis of what's going on given, and this little line means given, my sensory data, given all the information that I'm getting from my senses. And Bayes' theorem tells us that the way to calculate that is to start with my prior probability of how likely these features are. How likely am I to see an apple? You know, what's the prior probability? You know, I'm reasonably likely to see an apple. So that's, we start with the prior, and then we multiply it by the likelihood of the data. And that is, what is the probability that if this were an apple, if I was correct about my hypothesis that this is an apple, I would see this particular sensory data from it, okay? And that's the likelihood of the data, very important. And then there is this term on the bottom of the fraction, which is just how likely am I to see this data in general, okay? And that turns out to be problematic. That bottom of the fraction turns out for you to kind of, turns out to be computationally explosive. You have to kind of, to really calculate that, you have to take into account every single possible hypothesis. This could be an apple, this could be a nuclear bomb, this could be an alien, you know, it's impossible to do. And so Bayes' theorem turns out to be computationally explosive. And this is a big problem. And this is the problem that we face in artificial intelligence and in machine learning. And it's also the same problem that we face in evolution. So how do we solve this in AI and machine learning? And how do we solve it in evolution? Turns out we're going to have to do something else. Now, let's take some inspiration. I was at DeepMind, and so, the way I'm coming at this is really by looking at artificial neural networks. So I think it's a brilliant way to understand, what's going on. So in the last couple of decades, there's been this huge revolution in deep learning. And roughly speaking, neural networks somehow managed to do this perception problem. You feed a neural network lots and lots of data, like lots of faces, right? And somehow they extract the features that we want. They figure out what they're looking at. They figure out the high-level features that they're looking at faces. And in fact, if you look at the neural networks, somewhere in the beginning of the network, they start to extract low-level features, these sort of edges and corners. I don't know if you can make them out, the black and white patches. And then somewhere in the middle of the network, they're extracting mid-level features like eyes and noses and mouths. And then finally, they put them together and they extract high-level features. So we want to do that. We want that trick, and maybe that's how evolution does it. So let's just see how does a neural network work. So I'm not going to go through all of this stuff, but basically sensory data comes in from the bottom, and we need to train the weights of this, and it goes into these neurons, and we need to train these synaptic weights, these weights between neurons, in a way that somehow learns the structure of the world and can identify faces. And how do we do that? We do that by training the network with ground truth. In other words, the true features. You compare the true features with the what the neural network is guessing, and that gives you a prediction error. And we use that prediction error to then adjust the weights through a very famous algorithm called the backpropagation algorithm. And then slowly, the network comes to learn how to identify real faces, and it works really well. But we got a big problem. Anyone spot what that is? There is no supervisor in the brain. Who is supervising? Where is the ground truth? We already just talked about the fact that maybe we don't have access to ultimate reality. So how do we do this in machine learning? Well, there's one thing that we do know, which is the data itself. And that turns out to be our supervisor. So the basic idea is, just as we have this, this triangular network, which gets narrower and narrower, it's kind of an information bottleneck until we get to the feature vector. In other words, what's in the world. In other words, there's an apple and there's a pair of glasses in the world. What we then do is put another network on top, which is then going to say, if this is what I'm seeing, if I'm seeing an apple and a pair of glasses, what would my sensory data be? What would I predict that I'm looking at? So you then go up the neural network and you predict your a data vector. And then you compare the actual sensory data that you've got with the predicted data, and you get an error, and that error signal can then train in the same way the weights of the neural network. So this is a very important architecture. The bottom triangle is called the encoder or the recognition model. Okay, and this little gray bar here is called the code or the latent layer. And if you ever wondered, for those of you who know about this kind of thing, if you ever wondered what the code in predictive coding was, well, that's the code there. And then on top, you got the decoder, which is called the generative model. So we got the recognition model, which essentially recognizes what the features are. And then we got a generative model, which is essentially simulating the data. All right. And this is extremely important. So The problem is that this type of network is extremely difficult to train. And so around 2014 at DeepMind, we created a different way to train this kind of network. It was called a variational autoencoder. And what it used is instead of using simply the prediction error to train it, it used something else called the free energy, which I'm going to explain. It's an information theoretic term. It includes the prediction errors roughly, but it has other things. It has, in fact, specifically another requirement, which is that this feature vector can't be very far or is penalized for being very far from your prior beliefs, from your priors. And so, you know, if this was kind of ambiguous and I just didn't get much sensory data from it, this apple, you know, it could be a bomb or it could be an apple, I'm going to perceive it as an apple because the prior probability of seeing an apple in my hand is much higher than seeing a bomb. So I've just described a kind of this machine learning architecture, this neural network, deep neural network, which is doing unsupervised learning. And the way to understand what's going on in the brain is that, roughly speaking, that is exactly what's going on in the brain. And this kind of hypothesis goes under many names. The broadest is probably the Bayesian brain model, but it's sometimes called cognitive Bayesianism. A narrower form is called predictive coding or predictive processing more generally, or even more generally, and you know, a much bigger idea is the free energy principle. Okay, except that in the brain, actually, we don't see the generative model coming up like this. What we actually see is the generative model sort of folds back onto the recognition model. And so what we then find is that in the brain, you know, many of you would know that, like, there are far more feedback connections in the brain than feed-forward connections. And this was always a mystery. If the brain is some sort of information processing machine that takes in sensory data and then processes it up to what your perceptions are, how come there's so many feedback connections? And this is probably why, because the generative model is coming down. And the basic idea is that, in fact, the generative model is telling us what our predictions are. And one proposal is that all the brain needs to do is pass up the prediction errors where the generative model is kind of wrong compared to the sensory data. So the prediction errors gets passed up, and roughly speaking, that's kind of like the data being passed up, and the predictions from your generative model are being passed down. Okay, so, but where do these priors come from? These priors that are constraining the code come from, the idea is that they come from higher levels, and priors from higher levels constrain the code of the level below. And these are, if you like, these priors essentially are what we think about as beliefs. And those priors for the model above come from another model above that. And this is the basic idea of a hierarchical predictive coding scheme, hierarchical predictive processing. And it's going to be central. And, you know, how many of these levels are there? Well, you know, no one really knows. I once asked a famous neuroscientist, and he thought there was 6. I don't know why. So I'm going to, the next few slides are going to just slightly demystify the free energy principle and variational, the variational algorithm, but I'm actually going to go through them very fast because you know, that's not the purpose. It's more to say that there's nothing mysterious going on. But the basic algorithm, which I'm going to really skip past here, is that as we get sensory data from the world, And we have to make a guess, sort of this blue model down here, the recognition model of what our posteriors are. And that will give us our code. And that then gets fed into the generative model, out of which we get our perception of the world. And that's the key thing. Just let me emphasize this. What we perceive, if we're conscious of it, is in fact our generative model. We are perceiving our construction of the world. But this construction, of course, is constrained. Why is it constrained? Because what we then do is compare the output of this generative model to the actual sensory data, and that sets up a prediction error. And then we combine that with one other thing, which is the distance that, that these features that we have compared to our priors of them. So the distance that this is an apple compared to the prior that it's an apple. And these things get fed into something together called the free energy. And we then twiddle the knobs of the generative model and the recognition density, twiddle all the knobs and levers to minimize that free energy. In other words, minimize the prediction errors and the deviation from the priors. And that way, slowly, the approximate posterior converges to something like the true posterior, but how do we know what that is? Okay, again, I'm going to do this even faster, which is, what is this stuff like free energy? Okay, I'll do a tutorial on this at another stage, but roughly speaking, I just want to kind of, rush through this to say that there's nothing mysterious going on. We just basically start with Bayes' formula, and then we have to make an approximate posterior. And we basically say, look, let's minimize the distance between this approximate posterior and the true thing, and then we rewrite this a couple of times and put in Bayes' formula in there, and then we basically get this thing here. And so what we're trying to do is minimize this thing, and what we see is that this thing here is just a constant, and therefore if we minimize the first two terms, we minimize what we're trying to do, which is get close to the posterior of what's going on in the world. And the first two terms are called the free energy. Now, very quickly, just want to understand these two terms. The first term is the surprise in the sensory data. Okay, so what it is saying, look, how surprising is that I would see these sensations if it was an apple. Okay, so the more surprising that data, the more you get penalized for that. And then the second term, and this is really important, is the distance between your best guess of what's going on, your hypothesis of what's going on, and the prior. And I mean, here's a good example. This animal. Suppose that it looks like a polar bear or a dog, and in fact. Let's suppose that the surprise of the data as a polar bear and as a dog is roughly the same. In other words, it fits the model of a polar bear or a dog, but I might perceive it as a dog in an urban street in the UK. Why? Because there aren't polar bears around, and therefore I'll see it as a cute furry dog. And that's the second term. So there's basically two terms. And why is it called free energy? Just, everyone asks, oh, what is this like to do with free energy? I thought free energy was to do with kind of entropy and all this kind of stuff. Well, if we rewrite this free energy term again in another way, we basically see that this thing looks of the same mathematical form as energy. These things are energies, negative log probabilities of energy. Why is that? Because of Boltzmann's Boltzmann distribution. You basically just take energies are related to probabilities through an exponential. So log is the kind of inverse function to an exponential. And there's the negative sign. And so the first term is simply the average energy, and the second term is the same form as an entropy. And therefore, energy minus entropy is the free energy. And so that's why it's free energy. Nothing mysterious here. And before we move on and from the free energy, I just want to acknowledge that in this same framework of free energy, action has been incorporated. And I think that that is kind of amazing. Carl Friston, who really is the key architect of this free energy principle, I think deserves a lot of credit for this very parsimonious bringing of action into perception. So into the same framework as being used for perception. So essentially what happens is that you have goal states. And those goal states are essentially your priors. So if I have a prior to say, my prior is that I've got the apple in my right hand and my right hand's here, then that's a prediction error and I'm going to move my hand to get the apple. So enough said on that. Now, again, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but this is going to be important to understand what's going on and how to understand meditation. But roughly speaking, in this free energy principle, if we make an approximation that all these distributions that we're talking about are Gaussian, real Gaussian distributions, then there is a very simple result that comes out, which is that the posterior belief that we have, the posterior that we're trying to find, is somehow a weighted average of our prior belief and our sensory evidence. That's super important. And this is extremely important because the neurophenomenological hypothesis is that if the posterior belief is what I believe, if I'm conscious of it, it's what I experience. So my experience, what I actually experience, is somehow a weighted average of my prior and the likelihood of the data, these two terms in Bayes' theorem. And they're combined, the weights of how to combine them is going to be how precise they are. And so precision is the inverse of variance. So the more sharply pointed these distributions are, the more they count in the weighted average for my posterior belief. So if a prior belief is very accurate, but it's a kind of foggy day, so I don't really kind of have a lot of confidence in my sensory data, then my posterior is going to be closer to my prior. But on the other hand, if the day suddenly clears up and I can get a very clear sensory data, then my posterior shifts towards the sensory data. And similarly, if I'm very uncertain about my priors, again, my posterior will shift towards the sensory evidence. Okay, so now coming back to, trying to put this hierarchical predictive processing model together. The priors coming from above have to somehow compete with the sensory data coming up. And it is these precision weights that we talked about that that influence how much the priors count compared to the sensory data. Okay, so people use the word precision weighting. I just like to use weighting because I think precision is like trying to make it too mathematical, because these things are influenced by neuromodulators and all sorts of things. But anyway, the literature talks about precision weights, so we'll use that as well. And this is very important because the Gestalt, our perception of the world, the Gestalt is influenced by how much we trust our kind of prior expectations and our building compared to the sensory data. Now, the hierarchical predictive processing model. Okay, so these are the hierarchies, but what is it actually? What are these? I don't know what this is. Oh dear, I don't know.
That's a surprise, right?
Yeah. Well, okay, I'll have to read because what's on the top of this hierarchy is very important. So in 2015, there was this amazing analysis done of 17,000 fMRI experiments using neurosynth and a machine learning algorithm that actually looked and said, can we, from all the data that we have so far, figure out what the cortical hierarchy really is? and what we found is that right at the bottom, the low-level features near the sensory data were things like somatosensation and muscles and prosodic, phonemes and raw sounds and basic sensations. And then going up, we got things like motion and things like that. And then right at the top, which is blocked, I do apologize, but you would see a very nice, I won't try. Okay. Right at the top are concepts, names, reasoning, okay, and planning and things like that. And so this is what we're talking about in terms of how the brain is constructing our reality. We've got this hierarchical processing, which is a hierarchical model of a hierarchical generative model of creating our reality. And right at the top of the most processed, the most high level would be these concepts. Now, a pyramid is very nice, but actually a much better picture is in fact this kind of picture, because for one thing, it really brings out the fact that the brain is getting data, not just from the outside world. We're getting data from our somatosensations, our body sensations. We're getting data from our viscera, our heart and our gut and, all this kind of stuff. And proprioception, where our limbs are in space, from our joints. And that's combined with vision and audition and this motor system, of course, is going outwards, olfaction and taste. And this is the picture that we have of the hierarchical predictive model. And somehow, as we come into the center, there is this idea that this is who we are. This is determining our phenomenology. And I think that this kind of idea has really been explained amazingly well. If you, Anil Seth has done a phenomenal job in his latest book. If you want to have probably the best account of this whole view, read Anil Seth's Being You, because I think it's a great idea, and it sort of elaborates his view that the brain is a controlled hallucination, which really, actually Chris Frith really came to this view in his book, which was probably the best book before Anil Seth's book. And the idea is that the body is the first prior. I somehow am predicting myself, and therefore I am. So let's look at the self model. So somehow, not only must we be creating a simulation of the world, but we also must be modeling ourselves into it, how we react, what our agency is. There's the sort of arena of multisensory integration. There's a sense of agency that we have, that we control our actions. There's an experience of mindness. This is my arm. There's a perspectivity that, I'm here looking out, and there's a kind of polar coordinates from me in space and time. And there's a phenomenal transparency. Okay, now this we need to unpack. What is phenomenal transparency? If you look at this bird, it looks like, we're seeing the bird. We might not notice that we're actually looking at this bird through a window. And if we suddenly become aware that we're looking at the bird through the window, and that this window, of course, is representing a kind of a model, or that this bird is being constructed, then that is called opacity. It's a bit confusing, but this term was, this distinction between transparency and opacity was first introduced by G.E. Moore, but really brought out in recent years by Thomas Metzinger, who's really worked on this phenomenal self model. And there is, it's an amazing thing to see something that, oh, there's actually a construction process here. And if you can become aware that you're constructing your reality and that becomes opaque, that's pretty phenomenal. And that's a pun, but that's the kind of thing that can happen in meditation. And Thomas Metzinger, this is a quote from Thomas Metzinger: if the self model of a conscious system would become fully opaque, then the phenomenal target property, the phenomenal property of the experiential selfhood would disappear. And so if you were to actually become aware of this construction of the self model, then perhaps your sense, your illusory sense of being a self would actually disappear. And this is a kind of a really beautiful schema of, you know, what this kind of a self model would be. So let's look at it now. This is really at the heart of things now. So what we've got so far is that we construct our world. Our world is ultimately a fabrication, but not any old fabrication. It's a constrained fabrication. And the neurophenomenological hypothesis that we got is that what our perception, what our phenomenal experiences is the generative model. And what are we generating? So we've got someone looking at a tree, they receive internal and external data, and this is the output of their generative model. This is their phenomenal experience. They have a representation of a tree. They fabricate a tree, and they also have a representation of themselves, an avatar, you know. But not just that. Look, that we're aware of our thoughts, that we have thoughts, and these thoughts could be visual sensations, and they could be auditory, you know, blah, 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 I'm thinking to myself and I'm hearing. And we also have sensations through the body, somatosensory experience. And we have sensations of viscera. Oh, I got a tummy ache, and proprioception. And smells, odors, and the sense of the breath at the nose. These are all part of my construction, my fabrication. And sounds, and my heartbeat, I can feel sometimes. And emotions. So I have all these emotions, and if I can sometimes tune into them, and they're all these emotions. Now, but where's the phenomenal self-model? So this is obviously not the way we normally experience the world, because what we really experience is this kind of, it's organized into a system, a subject-object duality. Who wants to see that animation again? Let's do this. Right. So so what we have is we have a subject here, and we say, well, this is all me, and these are all mine, and there's a sense of mineness, and there's a sense of perspectivity that, look, I'm looking out onto the world, and I can see a tree, and it's so many meters from me, and this angle. And there's a subject-object duality about this, that here I am, and here is an object, and it's not me. And then there's a sense of agency, So we've got the sense of a Cartesian theater with an agent, who's got this kind of a doer, sort of games controller. And that is the kind of picture that we create. And that's our normal picture of being an agent. And that's very helpful from an evolutionary perspective, because we need to think of ourselves as agents. Otherwise, we would be eaten by the tiger. So we've actually done a lot of work in the Bayesian brain model, but this is all going to be absolutely critical to understanding how we will then deconstruct our world in meditation. So let's just quickly look at families of meditation. So there's a nice taxonomy that's been done in the last few years. One major family of meditations is called the attention family. And, focused attention, for example, counting breath at your nose, or feeling breath sensations or anything like that, saying a word, a sound is part of that. Open monitoring meditations. And these meditations tend to calm the mind. They tend to reduce the contents of awareness. The second class of meditations are the deconstruction family. And those are, things like mindfulness, in fact, end up being used as deconstruction techniques, and Vipassana and insight meditation. And we'll come on to see how they are, but they essentially deconstruct our models of the world. And then the third class of meditations are the constructive family and the famous one, for example, the most famous one might be something like loving kindness practice or compassion practice. So we're going to look at this. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of research done in this, and we're not going to look at the brain data at all, except to notice that there are some key features that keep coming up: attentional systems and self-awareness and emotional regulation. But what we want is to not just look at neural correlates. We want to look at a map of what's going on. So let's first look at focused attention meditation. So the general instruction in focused attention meditation, for example, might be really pay attention to the sensations of the breath of the nose, and just pay attention to the breath. And the predictive processing account would be something like that. By paying attention, what we are doing is putting more attention onto the sensory evidence, the data of these sensations. So what we do is we increase the precision weighting of the sensory data from the object of meditation, and we decrease precision weighting in all the other things, all the other phenomena that are around. And slowly that shifts the posterior closer to the sensations of the breath of the nose, and that's what it is to pay attention. That's the idea from a predictive processing point of view. And that affects our phenomenology. So you noticed that can you see that these things are faded? I can't see, yes. So you can see that the other phenomena are still there, but they're not kind of salient in our perception. They're quiet, and we focus on the breath. And this kind of attention meditation not only just trains the skill of attending to, but it also trains meta-awareness. In other words, where is my attention? What am I paying attention to? And quietens quietens the mind. So, and it's important also to say that the object of meditation doesn't have to be narrow; it can be quite broad, in fact. Now, the second class of meditations are really key and going to really be explained well from a predictive processing point of view. So we talked about this cortical hierarchy, and you didn't see the top of that. Well, there's the concepts. Now it's too small and you can't read it, but somehow what we want to do in a deconstruction type meditation is to go down the cortical hierarchy of fabrication and unfabricate, somehow turn down the influence of the top level models. So we are going towards making things, the objectness, we're quietening the objectness of things. And that's sometimes called deification. They don't seem so real. They're kind of deconstructed. And in Buddhist terminology, that's called emptiness. It's sort of going to be related to a pacification. If things are opaque, they somehow become, when you realize that this is just a mental construction, and when I'm constructing this, it's not so real. Now, I mean, take for example, you've got these neural networks again, so we got faces here, but instead of seeing faces, eventually I could just perceive that, oh, they're just made of these eyes and noses and mouths, and that's what you're seeing, and sort of all looks like a Cubist Picasso picture or something. And then even you can deconstruct it down to the the edges and corners, and this is what's happening in the unfabricating move. Another way to deconstruct is just to see processes as objects as processes. I somehow, I might have a pain in my knee and it's all very solid, but then as I pay attention to it, it just becomes this flux of body sensations and just a process. I mean, it might sound strange. So I mean, I think about this, and I think there's a good example which can bring it out to you. There's this idea of semantic satiation. It works by a different mechanism, not by meditation, but it's a good way of thinking about it. I mean, if we say flowers, 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 flowers many, many times, we lose the meaning of it. I mean, let's try it. Let's try it with something like dog. Let's all say dog 20 times and see what happens. All right? Dog, 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 dog. It's kind of weird, because what starts to happen is that we just hear these sounds. The sort of sense of a canine disappears, and that's a little bit what it is like. I mean, it's not like there's nothing there. It's just that the word dog becomes empty of the concept, of the meaning. Another example, a classic example, would be like looking at this little picture of a monitor, and it says default monitor, and we can read it. I mean, what happens as we blow it up? I mean, all you see are these RGB pixels, and yet it's all still there. So the idea in deconstruction, Vipassana type meditation, is that we reduce the precision weighting of the top level priors. We reduce the weighting of the top level priors. So concepts are weakened, thoughts are weakened, higher level beliefs are weakened. And then we end up with more influence of mid-level priors, mid-level models like motion and faces and features. I mean, that might be some, when you look out at the clouds and you're all relaxed, and then you suddenly start seeing faces in the clouds and things like that, because you're not, dominated by all these thoughts and concepts. And you can take it further and deconstruct those and reduce the levels. And then you just end up with raw body sensations, raw sounds, low-level models. So this is descending the cortical fabrication hierarchy. Now, as we start to deconstruct our phenomena, they're kind of there, but they're deconstructed. There's a kind of global opacity. We can see that they're mental constructions. and they're just kind of wispy and ephemeral. And as we take focused and as we calm the contents of the mind through, for example, things like focused meditation, then even they then become quite calm themselves. And we notice that in this state, when things are quite deconstructed and quite calm, at that state, we can start to recognize the empty phenomenal experience itself, the space, the empty space of phenomenal experience between in all phenomena. And so that is an important recognition. Ah, look, you know, there is actually the space of phenomena, and that is called non-dual awareness. So that is recognizing non-dual awareness. Non-dual awareness, and here I've tried to represent it in this kind of pink shade, non-dual awareness is the substrate on which the generative model itself arises. It is awareness. And so normally we're just kind of aware of ourselves, but that we're conscious. But now we recognize that not only, but everything is within our generative model. This whole experience is consciousness, is awareness. And it's important to understand this idea of non-dual awareness a little bit, just through some metaphors that have been classically used. The classic metaphor is the idea that non-dual awareness is kind of like a mirror which reflects everything in it, and but it's not affected by the reflections, of course. Or a movie screen on which a movie is playing, and you're all caught up in the characters, and this is, but you know, this is happening and this is happening, but you can suddenly become aware of the screen itself, that actually the movie is all just the screen. Or another classic one is the sky. You know, doesn't matter if there's a storm going on with clouds and, you know, all sorts of things, but it's all just the sky. An ocean in the waves is a really beautiful one, which is that, you know, we're just normally used to seeing waves in the ocean, but suddenly we can become aware that it's all just ocean. Or, you know, a one that's maybe more modern is the concept of a field, you know, from physics. So that we suddenly, you know, we have a field in its vibrational modes is the idea of non-dual awareness. So here's the thing. So we, you know, we're looking at the tree, and we then recognize this non-dual awareness, and we say, oh, it was here all along. And actually, this is all my consciousness. So normally, you know, I'm used to thinking about my consciousness. If you ask somebody like, you know, where do you feel like you are? Where are you conscious? It's somewhere behind my eyes. And then they say, well, actually, later on, they say, you know, I can actually be aware of my whole body all at once. And this is who I am. And then you realize that your whole perception, your whole phenomenal experience is your awareness. And it doesn't matter what's playing in your awareness. You are the whole bubble. So non-dual awareness has been termed, has had many names in many traditions over the last few thousand years. You know, pure awareness, pure consciousness, Rigpa in Tibetan, timeless awareness, being, consciousness, bliss in Vedanta, in Indian philosophy, the self, capital S, self, the fourth state of consciousness, Brahman, Buddha nature, clear light, the ground of being, or the groundless ground, because that doesn't have ground, capital E, emptiness, the deathless, the peace that passeth understanding. And there are many people have tried to talk about this kind of thing and try to talk about the dimensions of non-dual awareness: presence, being, emptiness, some sort of inherent reflexivity, which means that it knows itself. Lots of discussion. The main point to make here is that we might be talking about a similar phenomenology across all these traditions, but somehow different metaphysical stories. So that's instructive in its own right. And one of the last important things before I move on to really kind of just highlight, just in case we start to reify awareness itself, is that awareness itself is also empty. Everything is a construction. After all, the basic idea in Bayesian inference is that, the entry principle is, roughly speaking, what's the best hypothesis for my sensory data? So now, starting to put it all together, let's look at the phenomenological dimensions of meditation. So we're going to take a look at 3 dimensions. The first is this, this dimension going into the screen. And that dimension, these are sort of, roughly speaking, similar things. They go in the same direction. There are 4 different things, but they point in the same direction. Reduced phenomenal content, calming the mind, quietening the contents of consciousness, increasing concentration. And so what we see is that when we start off in a kind of monkey mind, where there's lots of things are just a normal mind, and you're flitting from idea to idea, and then a novice focused attention meditator would start to quieten the contents of the mind, and an expert would further quieten. Now, the next family would be the deconstructive meditations, where you're now unfabricating. You're unfabricating and also quietening to some extent, and an expert would unfabricate even further. And notice now that the height of these little flowers are getting taller. And that's the 3rd dimension, which is the non-dual awareness, recognizing the empty space of phenomenal experience itself. And what happens if we were to have maximum quietness, maximum deconstruction, and maximum non-dual awareness? Well, that would be a very special deep non-dual absorption state, which actually has been termed now the minimal phenomenal awareness. And Thomas Metzinger has actually done some very really interesting analysis on survey data looking at the state in 2020. And it is some sort of deep non-dual absorption state, some deep samadhi state, as some traditions would have it. And you might think, well, that's kind of the peak of meditation, but there is a view that, in fact, the peak of meditation is, another stage is, in fact, can you bring that non-dual awareness back with full busyness of mind? Perhaps you're slightly still unfabricated a little bit, but that bringing that awareness back is what's interesting. And that's kind of having the full panoply of the phenomenal experiences of the tree and my body sensations and my emotions, but somehow not organized into a subject-object duality. And it is possible to experience the world in that way. Now, Morten's been very generous, but I don't want to overstretch. But so I'll just mention a little bit about the jhanas, and if anyone's interested in this, they can ask a question in the Q&A, and I can further. But the jhanas are a series of quite advanced states of meditations, altered states of consciousness, with beautiful names like energy and pleasure and joy and serenity and infinite space and infinite consciousness and nothingness. And there are, in my view of things, I think in the predictive processing point of view, they are a staged unfabrication, a skillful unfabrication of the world, and beautiful states.
I didn't catch that. You can try again.
My Siri? No. Right. So yeah, predictive processing models of meditation is quite a young field, and I just, there's only been a few papers out there. Just want to make a special call out to Ruben Lekonen and Helene Slagter's paper last year, which has, is a similar kind of story. I mean, I take a slightly different perspective to them, but they did really an amazing job, especially of putting together, linking it to how it fits together with the meditation data that's out there. Another paper that's worth just mentioning is this work with Lars Stanworth Smith, who is in Antoine Lutz's lab, and that's very interesting. It's a sort of deep hierarchical generative model of meta-awareness. So, not only do I have a sense of what I'm perceiving, but I also am attending to certain things, and then am I aware of what I'm attending to, where my attention is? And that's modeling that third category of meta awareness. Okay, so now on to some of the good stuff, which is after deconstructing yourself, reconstructing yourself. So through meditation and many practices and things like psychedelics, we can reduce the weight of the higher level priors, beliefs, models, assumptions, attitudes that we're using. And this model, this is the basic idea behind the Revis model, which I'll talk about, is this idea that as we go through meditation, we are deconstructing these concepts and higher level beliefs and mid-level structures. Now, at that stage, this allows other priors to enter. So we enter something, let's call it reprogramming mode. By reducing the strength of these top level priors, we enter reprogramming mode. And then at that stage, we can upload new programs. There are certain practices that can help you upload new programs, like constructive meditation practices, like loving kindness meditation. I mean, there are practices in Tibetan Buddhism called Yidam practice, where you skillfully fabricate yourself into, for example, a goddess, and it's kind of amazing, and then a more general idea of soul making. So how does this really work? Well, the Revis model that was put out 3 years ago is this idea that as we reduce the weight of our top level priors, essentially we can think about a free energy landscape where through the use of, for example, acute use of psychedelics or meditation, we are somehow flattening that landscape of priors. And so we can move from one attractor set to another attractor set. And in recent, I mean, there's a sort of update of this kind of idea that Robin Carhart-Harris, Carl Friston, and a number of us are co-authors, including Fernando and Pedro and myself, are on this, is this idea of generalizing this idea as a general model of psychopathology. And this work is forthcoming. And here's a beautiful kind of landscape that we use, sort of comes from developmental biology. It's called the Waddington landscape. But essentially, you can think about it that this landscape is really a free energy landscape, and that we might have got stuck in a rut, in a prior here, and we sort of view the world in a certain way. And then as we relax the landscape, we're more able to hop into different attractor basins, different state spaces of beliefs and priors. So we can reformulate our view. And then, in fact, ultimately, you know, you know, the best thing is that you can hop between them as you need to. So then we come to the, I would say, the deepest, or one of the deepest ideas, especially in Buddhist thinking, which is dependent co-arising. And I'm going to cast dependent co-arising as Bayesian inference. So we've seen that the experience of the world is a construction, but it's a constrained construction. And it's constrained by external data and internal beliefs, priors, and assumption. And the question is, can we make that construction beautiful? So we get external data, and what we bring to the experience world is ways of looking, high-level priors, high-level beliefs, high-level models. And those come together as the two terms of Bayes' theorem, in fact, as your priors, the ways of looking, and the likelihood of the data. How likely is the data if that was the correct hypothesis? And that gives us our experienced world. Now, for example, here's a way of looking. I mean, if I'm a depressed person, I say, you know, the world's a terrible place. Everything always goes wrong, and I'm a useless person. And then I look at the world through that lens. Look, this sort of blue lens here. I look at the world through that blue lens, and I see, guess what? The world is an awful place. Everything always goes wrong, and I'm a useless person. You focused on the negative, you found the negative, and you're stuck. And what you get is feedback from your evidence. You get a Bayesian updating, which revalidates that lens. And so that lens of being a depressed person keeps you stuck. It's self-reinforcing. On the other hand, if I have a lens which is the world's an amazing place, and it's beautiful, and it's a kind of a gift, it's a miracle, and I look at the world with that lens, guess what? That's the kind of world that I experience, and it validates that lens. So this kind of ways of looking approach, I think, can be truly liberating. And this was ideas that Rob Babeyev was very keen on, ways of looking. So finally, before we end, we've been through quite a lot, but there's one thing that we kind of left hanging, which was that so far we've just been talking about our experienced world, our phenomenal world, what Immanuel Kant called our phenomenal world. We've talked nothing about the world as it is in itself, the noumenal world, the thing in itself. And I'm not going to say much about this, but Schopenhauer kind of found a loophole in Kant. And that was that we ourselves are the thing in itself. If the one thing we have access to is ourselves, and we ourselves are the thing in itself, are part of reality. And there is, or there may be, a subterranean passage, as he puts it, to the nature of things. And well, that's kind of mysterious, but meditation can, if there is such a passage, meditation might help us there. So we've been through a lot, and I again want to thank Morten for being so gracious with time. I think it's important to see this as a really important story, and how well the kind of predictive processing framework works with meditation. The world is a construction, a beautiful, constrained construction, and has a lot more degrees of freedom than we think. And perhaps things like meditation and psychedelics and other practices can help us find other degrees of freedom, ways of looking that are more beautiful. And before I go, I want to just acknowledge two meditation teachers that have had, I think, an influence on me in these ideas. Michael Taft, Deconstructing Yourself, and Rob Bear, the late great Rob Bear. And I just want to end with this story of the 7 blind men and the elephant, because I think having put this whole framework, I still want to say that 7 men and the blind and 7 blind men and the elephant is still the deepest principle, which is that the elephant is supposed to represent sort of ultimate truth. And, you know, one blind man thinks that the elephant is like a wall because he's feeling the body, and another one thinks it's like a rope because he's feeling the tail, another one like a sword or a tree trunk. And these are all narratives, and that's not to say all narratives are equally as good. There are better stories and worse stories, and I would commend this one as quite a good story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shamil. That was extraordinary. I love the animation, especially the netbooks. For those of you who have elsewhere to be, that this we're taking questions now, but we will also continue afterwards with coffee, tea, chocolate, and fruit. But maybe if there's any questions we want to take up here on camera for those online as well, and I'll check whether anybody online will have something to say. I think we'll start with Petra.
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. So that's quite a long journey. That was great. I was very curious when you were presenting, you were talking about introducing non-dual awareness, and you were saying all of these different names that it has received across different traditions and different cultures. A few of them were including the word bliss, and I'm not sure if maybe my interpretation of this is incomplete, but to me, bliss has a very strong positively valence, like a very almost euphoric sense. Would you say that is true for non-dual awareness in general, or what is that?
Well, I think this is a deep question in non-duality. What the ultimate nature of non-dual awareness is, and perhaps there are different things it can tune into. And normally people tune into a kind of peace or infinite expanse, or these kind of things. But some people report bliss, love, and I'm just let's just be open to say, well, these are different things, and maybe it's that bliss and peace are bliss and love are the first subtlest fabrications. So maybe that. So it's a good question. I ask that to myself a lot. So good question.
Yeah, first, I just want to say, extraordinary talk. I feel like everything I've ever wanted to hear in a presentation was here for an hour and a half. It was amazing. Everything was here. There's so much to talk about, but I wanted to ask about these first level priors, stemming from the body that you spoke of, sense of blindness. I forget what the other things that you mentioned were, but how do you translate things like this, things like these that are so abstract and theoretical, it seems, into probability distributions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I mean, if we take this literally and we're trying to model with these kind of things, I would say you're going to need at least 1,000 dimensional spaces for starters. I showed little bell curves on one dimension, but think of 1,000 dimensions. So this is this is a conceptual idea. How we take it to the next level is really great, and I'm so glad you're doing a PhD on it, because we'll figure this out together. But good question, and yeah, great questions. Yeah.
So I got the feeling that you were talking about different hierarchies in different points. So, for example, there between sensory and the prior, that would be one going up and down, and then you have the pyramid with the sensory. That's another one.
I would say that
Or,
they're all. I think they're all similar hierarchies with kind of sensory data near the bottom. It's the kind of typical cortical hierarchy that we normally have, kind of V1 and V2 at the bottom, and then, the grandmother at the top and that kind of thing. It's just that showing it in that pyramid structure was from the machine learning of the purely what it might look like. Another representation of that same thing is spreading it out into a circle with everything coming into the center. And this picture is simply showing it as a schematic using kind of autoencoders folded back, just to see that but this is just a sort of cartoon picture. Presumably there would be many of these modules at the bottom and many in the middle and many at the top, and who knows how it's organized, and in fact who knows if there aren't jumping loops and things are connected in kind of unhelpfully unneat ways.
so if they're the same, now my real question, you said in some point that the experience was the output of in that experience, or do we have a direct experience of the priors as well in some way? Or
yeah, that's okay, great. So again, this is exactly the kind of questions, the research questions that we need. Now, we're first going to have to solve what consciousness is. But really, this is really relevant stuff, because essentially what you're talking about is if we were to have a predictive processing theory of consciousness, what the output of the generative model, how would it relate to notions of in the IIT, to global workspace, to the back of the brain versus the front of the brain kind of thing? How deep would it go? Is it that actually we are kind of the back of the brain is where phenomenal experience is, and we really are aware of the kind of details, but then higher level things are kind of further up the hierarchy or being broadcast, and these are really important questions. I mean, to what extent are we aware of the gorilla in the basketball game? Anyway, I love all three questions are absolutely amazing, because this is the research agenda. I mean, this is very early conceptual stuff. Yeah.
I think you invited a question on this topic, and it relates to your drawing, your box here with the flowers of meditation.
Yeah.
And you said, you talked about, you mentioned the jhanas.
Right.
When you mentioned that, you lined the flowers up in a beautiful curve. So I'd like to ask a bit more about that.
Yeah.
Then tantalizing a few slides before, you suggested bringing that sort of flower back into consciousness. I guess, whoever it was, the people who were thinking about this some 2000, very roughly years ago, they had a kind of research project. They asked many questions in a certain sense, and I wonder, how that helps to inform the research you and your colleagues are doing now.
Right. Well, first of all, okay, the jhanas is that's a good cue in which I'll come to. But just on this point on non-dual, this idea of bringing non-dual awareness back into the world, I would say that to some extent, that's probably not there in maybe early Buddhism. It's something that developed in the non-dual ideas, the Mahayana and other things, and I think so. This has definitely been a development. So to some extent, some of the very early thinkers, might have just been about extinguishing, being in nirvana or something like that, not just living in the world. But that, I'm not sure. I mean, there's on the jhanas. I mean that's interesting. I mean, would you like? Are you curious about them? Would you like to understand?
If somebody wants to ask a question, I'm good, because there seems to be a real
yeah. Absolutely.
The sequence here, you deliberately done something.
So if you I'm very happy if you think I'd like to you'd like the jhanas are particularly interesting. I mean, they are a series of advanced meditation. So the way it works is that you start off here in the normal kind of mind, and to get into the jhanas, typically one needs to first develop some base level of concentration. And that's sometimes called access concentration. So, breath of the nose or the whole body awareness or something like that. And then I'll tell you the story of like how it goes. So you're quite right that there's a sort of curve. So it's getting quieter and quieter, also more and more unfabricated, and to some extent increasing in non-dual awareness. That itself, I would say, can rise or more or less steeply depending on the style. It may be possible to do jhanas from a non-dual place where it rises very much more steeply. Now, the idea is that as you become more concentrated and quieten the mind, you enter a state in which there is internal body sensations, which are described as energy, or the Pali word is piti, and they can be felt as champagne bubbles or vibrations or sensations or energy, and those can be seen as you can tune into the pleasurable component of that, and then they become physical pleasurable sensations. And I think the story is that probably maybe the brain's reward circuitry starts tuning into them more and more, and they become stronger and stronger, and then it becomes an absorbed state, a maximum state a state of absorption where just the whole phenomenal experience is this absolutely rapturous sensations of pleasure in the physical and the body. And then at some stage, you can tune into something that is even sweeter, if that was possible, which is a kind of more pure mental well-being component into that. So it moves into a sort of a more mental happiness or joy component. And the energy is still there, but it's more in the background. And that can become intense, and people can describe it as orgasmic and all sorts of things. These descriptions are there. And you think, well, where could I go from there? And then what happens is that you tune into something that's even more beautiful, which is some sort of a happiness, a peace, a contentedness. So all the positive happiness and joyous well-being component, but where the energy is right down, so it's peace instead. So a peaceful contentedness, as if you've satiated yourself, you've been very thirsty, and you've gone through the desert, and you come to a watering hole, and you've drunk and all this pleasure and joy, and you're fully satiated, and now you just lie back on the bank and enjoy feeling satiated and absolutely peaceful, and that can be even more delightful. And then you think, well, what could be more delightful than that? And you start to notice that actually, this kind of joy is sort of slightly fabricated, and what's really more beautiful is the underlying peace inside, just the pure peace. So now we have just absolute stillness and peace and equanimity in the body. And that's the fourth jhana, deep peace and stillness. And then you think, well, where could you go from there? Well, there's still more fabrication to go. There's still more unfabricating to go, because there's still the body. And as we know, the body is a construction. You know, we have this body map idea, and we can start unfabricating that body map. And what that feels like is the body map starts losing its boundaries, and you notice that there's no boundaries to this body map. And when there's no boundary, it's boundless and it feels spacious. And so the sense is that there's just infinite spaciousness in the stillness. And that's extremely liberating. I mean, you know, having been bound into this model of the body for, you know, this is our usual thing, to feel the expansive state can be very freeing and beautiful. And then you think, well, where do you go from there? But you see, space itself is a kind of construction, as we saw from Kant, as we saw from this phenomenal self-model, that space itself is a construction. And actually, everything's just made of consciousness. And so then the space kind of fades away, the space model fades away, and it's just infinite consciousness. And then you think, well, you know, where do you go from there? And then it starts getting a little strange, because you see that the consciousness is really underneath, is just this nothingness. And as you tune into the nothingness, all of it tunes into just nothingness. And that is even more, in some sense, liberating. I mean, I think that, you know, that could be something like the void. And if someone in a psychedelic trip is thrown into the void, that can be extremely frightening. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure, but, you know, I mean, I would imagine that if this is not being trained correctly, this would be frightening. And that is this pure nothingness, boundless nothingness, infinite nothingness. And then, of course, you know, surely there's nothing more than nothingness, and nothing less than nothingness, nothing more to unfabricate than nothingness. But there's one last thing, which is that there is the perception of nothingness. And this perception of nothingness is still a fabrication. And so the eighth jhana is a very strange kind of sense, because it is perception like only half forms. It doesn't quite land. The consciousness doesn't quite land, and yet it's not. And yet it's not nothing. But it's not non-perception. It's not. Yeah, I think it's the clues in the title. Neither perception nor non-perception. Okay, that's the clue. That's a clue. And
I think we'll have two more questions, and then we'll continue talking about the nothingness.
Yeah, please.
So what does the deconstruction of priors look like neurobiologically, and is it possible to get to zero information content priors?
It's interesting. Let's just look at this zero. Some people have speculated that some sort of deep samadhi state like this, where there is no, you know, could be also linked to minimal information. I don't know. So that's one idea, that that could be. So that people have talked about that, but it's a really good question. Now, what does deconstruction of priors mean, like neurobiologically? Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like, you know, what is it like when you see the all the ants in the ant colony without seeing the ant colony, or all the trees in the woods without seeing the forest, kind of thing? And I mean, you know, it's an excellent question, and you know, this is early days research, and we got to figure out, you know, is it, for example, higher levels, you know, will we actually find higher levels quietened? Now, one hint is the default mode network. I don't know, but many people have speculated, and I think there's something to this, that the default mode network, hold on, 1 second, yeah. Okay, many people have speculated that the default mode network here is, of course, we know it's suppressed under psychedelics, and it's also suppressed it's also quietened in meditators. So here's, you know, it's really, you know, this is Judd Brewer's work, but it's been reproduced a number of times, and we see a systematic disruption of the default mode network. Now, whether Carl and Robin speculated in the Revis paper that, you know, there's basically the default mode network is what sits on top of this hierarchy of priors, and that's what's quietened, and maybe we're picking it up. I don't know. Maybe we're picking it up in the default mode network, but that's a speculation that I think a few people hold. So that's one thing we could think about.
So 2 very quick questions, and then we have to have some coffee and some chocolate.
I'll be quick. Yeah, as a psychologist, I was very interested in the deconstructive methods in meditation, specifically the mindfulness-based practices that you talked about, and deconstructing the cognitions initially, and then shifting beliefs and perspectives in the end. So is there a tried and true method in deconstruction to kind of reach this meditative state? Great.
I mean, I think that actually there are loads of methods. And I think to some extent, you know, good psychotherapy is a great method. And to some extent, doing yoga is a great method, because like suddenly, instead of feeling all these emotions, now you're feeling all these body sensations and, you know, drilling down, and you can work with them and deconstruct. The typical ones in the Theravada early Buddhist lineages are Vipassana meditation, where you specifically go in and look at the impermanence of phenomena, that they're constructed. You look at the no selfness, that, like, you know, these phenomena are kind of, they're not mine. They're just there. They just appear. These thoughts are happening. They're not mine. I mean, I'm so used to identifying with my thoughts, but they're just arisings. You know, so looking at certain insights to do with them, or eventually just being able to learn to see the emptiness directly, their constructions. So there's all these kind of methods, but I think that we need to find new methods. You know, maybe putting on a helmet or something with kind of, you know, TNS or something is going to help us and doing meditation on that. So great. Yeah, I think there's lots of methods.
If my ideas are not mine, as you say, what does that spell for human agency and free will?
Great.
Especially the problem that you identified of no supervisor in the brain. Does that leave us vulnerable to higher influences, such as governments, media, and other infiltrators, if we're not aware of these processes? And also, if our sensory evidence can be tampered with and manipulated, doesn't that change our posterior belief and our priors?
Okay, that's a great question. And to some extent, the free will problem is still there. in the same way after understanding deconstruction, in the sense that, so even if you don't know anything about meditation or deconstruction, the free will problem is like the laws of physics are complete. Everything is determined or random, which doesn't help. And to what extent is there any agency? No. So the fact that we can see that agency is a kind of a construction is only just getting back to the sort of the philosophical debate back into the free will problem. So to some extent, I think that the free will problem is unaffected. We still have it. But now we can have more language around it, which is to say agency is a really useful way, a really useful model. Just because we're deconstructing these models doesn't mean they're not useful, or, I mean, sometimes they can be a little awry, or like a depression lens or something like that. So we can deconstruct it and reconstruct it better. But otherwise, we can deconstruct it, but we can use agency in the world. And people who, for example, meditate and then lose agency, they're in trouble. That's they're in trouble. They end up with things like DPDR, depersonalization, derealization, and that's not fun, I think. And so I think a permanent loss of agency is not, I think, what we're looking for. I think we should have a sense of agency because it's a useful model in the world. And I think that, in a sense, the world lands exactly where it is. All the things that are important for us to, we are, so we're playing these characters, or we are these characters, and we continue playing them well. So I think that, yeah, it's a great question, but I think it's enriched but unaffected by the free will.
Thank you so much, Shamil, again. Now I urge you to come and have some coffee, tea, some chocolate, and then we go away.